Hello everybody, you have tuned in to Eric Jose on Making a Murderer on YouTube. I cover virtually any aspect of making a murderer. I go over the evidence, the documents, the photos. So if you like, stay tuned, and in the future I'll have many more videos besides the one you're about to see. Hello everybody, we're back again today talking more about the Banc review for Brendan Dassey's habeas petition for, well, his grant of writ of habeas corpus. Oh, and for those of you who are wondering where you can listen to the full oral arguments without having to listen to this armchair detective, you can go down to the information below this video and you will find the full oral arguments right there, and you can listen to your heart's desire. So that's where you can find that. We're going to be talking about the second half of Luke Berg's, opening. The first video I did, you'll remember, was talking about the two facts that he offered, that Brendan offered without being fed. One of them was uncorroborated. One of them was provably false. So that was in the first video. This is going to be the second half of his opening. And this is going to mainly center around Kachinsky. The judges are asking him about Kachinsky and about the ineffectiveness of counsel and what his thoughts on it are. And then they get to talking about the voluntariness of the confession again. And, they talk about the fact that Brendan's guessing and that, then the investigators actually show frustration at certain points until Brendan picks up on something that they've been suggesting to him, and then they praise him because, he got it right, or, because now he's being honest, he's doing the right thing, and, so on and so forth. So they're questioning him about that sort of stuff, and ultimately, the last thing that he says that I just find to be, questionable, I will say at the least, talking about that when Brendan was being asked about what happened to Teresa's head, Luke Berg is trying to suggest that Brendan Dassey couldn't think of her being shot in the head because the investigators were talking about the bedroom. That somehow, when he's being pestered about what happened to her head, he wouldn't have considered what happened to her head throughout the whole entire time. He would have, I don't know. I mean, I get what he's trying to say maybe, but I don't think it's very plausible. I think when he had those two investigators in his face and he's making multiple guesses that are wrong, eventually he would have expanded his mind beyond the bedroom to think about other things that happened to her head. So that's, I think, one of the things that proves it's false, really. But so we're going to move in now to the first clip. The first clip is basically going to be where the judge is basically talking to Luke Berg about Kachinsky and reminding Luke Berg that at one point Kachinsky actually said that he felt that he was a representative for the victim's family. So she's got some things to say to him about that.
But actually, I want you for a minute, if you just take 2 minutes of your argument time to discuss the ineffectiveness of Mr. Kachinsky, since the district court is obviously horrified by that. The state courts are horrified by his behavior. They remove him from the case. And he actually says at some point, I consider myself to be representing the victims. So why doesn't that fall within the Kyler against Sullivan conflict of interest rubric?
What Kachinsky did is absolutely indefensible. We haven't defended it. But
so
he was removed.
Not representing it's as though it's worse than having no lawyer at all. He would have been better off pro se. He would have been better off with somebody who was not helping either the victim's family or the prosecution.
He was removed 8 months before trial.
But the harm was done. The harm in the term, you used these confessions at the trial. The harm was already done by the time Kachinsky leaves.
What he did had absolutely no effect on the primary confession, the March 1st confession. Kachinsky wasn't around until after the confession came in. That's absolutely not true. He moved to suppress the confession, and if you read the transcript, he made a lot of the same arguments that Dassey is now making on appeal.
I've read the transcript, of course.
He identified all of the same statements that Dassey has focused on, and he argued that it was coerced, and the court rejected that.
But of course, you don't have to show prejudice in a Kyler case. If you show conflicted counsel with an actual conflict of interest, you're done. The Sixth Amendment gives you the right to counsel.
You have to show an adverse effect.
Right.
So as I'm listening to them, talk about the fact of how and whether Mickens applies in this case and what it what it all means essentially, and I'm listening to the arguments, and it occurs to me that when Luke Berg says you must show an adverse effect, well, there was a very adverse effect of Kachinsky being Brendan's counsel, and that was the fact that he had O'Kelly go after him like a bulldog or a pit bull and get a second confession, bully a second confession out of the poor kid, and then handed him over to the officers who made sure to tell Brendan that he better repeat all of this to his mother on the prison phone, which would be recorded and then could be used at trial after this kid was once again victimized, bullied, and coerced. And that piece of evidence was used at Brendan's trial. The prosecution used it to discredit Brendan after he testified. They used it after the psychological expert who did the psychological evaluation of Brendan. They played it after he testified and to try to diminish him. And then they played it one more time during closing arguments. That phone call with Barb and Brendan. So that's a very adverse effect. I'm sorry, but if you want to talk about an adverse effect, that was a very adverse effect of Len Kachinsky's complete dereliction of duty, in my opinion.
But regardless, the Kyler claim is foreclosed on habeas because the Supreme Court clearly said in Mickens that Kyler is only clearly established for multiple concurrent representation. Nothing like that happened.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. I was looking at Mickens before this argument, and I don't see anything in Mickens that says the kind of conflicting concurrent representation has to be co-defendants. If he was essentially a member of the prosecution team, that's a party. That's a concurrent representation.
There is no allegation that he had any relationship with the prosecution, that he had any sort of financial incentives. He made some bad decisions.
Money doesn't matter.
Sure.
I mean, you could represent somebody without being compensated.
Well, we think the Kyler claim is clearly foreclosed by Mickens. It's a very clear statement from the Supreme Court. In Mickens, the court was considering successive representation. So you had a lawyer that was representing two different people. That's very close to multiple concurrent representation, and yet even there, the Supreme Court said that Sullivan doesn't clearly establish anything in that. Here you don't have anything like either multiple or successive representation. You have some bad decisions by counsel, sure.
Well, you have... I don't agree with that reading of Mickens, actually. So, because you do have active representation of conflicting interests.
Well, our position is that it's clearly foreclosed. So I'd like to move back to the voluntariness if I could.
So there was basically a discussion between the one judge and Luke Berg over whether or not the Mickens and Sullivan argument, or case law can apply here as clearly established Supreme Court case law that could be, looked to in this case. So that's what they're kind of going back and forth about. Obviously, Luke Berg is saying, no, it can't, it doesn't apply here. Obviously, that judge has a different opinion of it. She believes that Len Kachinsky was working for the victim's family because he said so. Doesn't matter if he received a penny. It doesn't matter if he received one single cent. In fact, he probably didn't. The fact that he said that he felt he was representing the victim's family shows you where his head was. And that means he was essentially serving two different people. He was basically ineffective as Brendan's counsel because he was representing the victim's family, which was basically the other side. So that's what this judge is saying. He didn't have to receive anything. He didn't have to be officially affiliated with the family or the prosecution at all, really. Although he did serve Brendan up to the prosecution on a silver platter, but that's not proof. But the point is that he was working for them, whether he was getting paid or not.
Another main piece of evidence that shows the voluntariness is the way he resisted the officers numerous times.
He's guessing. I mean, you see this as resistance. I see this as him sort of casting about. You see these long delays on the video where they ask him a question and he's obviously racking his brain as to how can I answer this in a way that you're going to like? How can I answer this quote unquote correctly? And, you know, his very diction is so unsophisticated. He just doesn't know what he's talking about.
The counter to that is that you have at least 35 different times that he resists the officer's questions. So they asked him 6 different questions on 4 separate occasions about whether he shot Teresa. And these were some of the most leading questions. They said, we know you shot her too, isn't that right? He says, no. They say, how many times did you shoot her when the gun was in your hands? He says, it never was in my hands. They asked 15 questions on 6 separate occasions about whether the fire was going when he got over there. He consistently said that it wasn't.
He answers every which way on some of these questions, whether it's about the fire, whether it's about where's the car in the garage, did you go first, did you go later? He's all over the map, and you can pick a sentence here and a sentence there and knit together a confession, but it's not what really happened.
It's true, he changes some details here and there.
Changes important details.
But that's exactly what you would expect for a traumatic memory like this. That's how memory works.
It's also what you would expect from somebody who is trying to say what the officers want to hear and isn't reading their mind.
Particularly because they show his frustration when he resists or disagrees with key details, and then they offer him praise, saying, oh, now we believe you, when he picks up on a fact that they have suggested to him when he's answered.
So there we have a couple of the judges pointing out what is really kind of painfully obvious to most of us, that Brendan is guessing. Pretty much everything out of his mouth, even though it comes out like a statement, well, it kind of sounds like a statement. He says everything, a lot of things with the inflection, as if he's saying it as a question. So the thing is that when he's constantly, answering like a question, making statements as if but questioning, means that he's afraid he's going to say the wrong thing. And it's painfully obvious to most of us, and it's definitely painfully obvious to these 2 judges that are kind of grilling Berg on it, saying, this seems pretty obvious. And Berg just, no, because these other things, which he talks about the bonfire and the questions about the bonfire and questions about the questions about the wires and stuff in the garage. I always found this odd when I'm listening to the confession, how they continually ask him about those wires up in the rafters and if they were ever used for anything or whatever. Why did they think anything about those wires up in the garage rafters, or I don't know, just weird. I just was wondering why they were so focused on that anyways. It just seemed odd. And then the one judge is basically flat out telling Luke Berg that, yeah, he also sounds like a person who's just guessing and can't read the investigators' minds, and so doesn't know exactly what they want to hear. That's what it really sounds like. The way most of us see it. And then, it goes on to where Judge Williams goes ahead and brings up the fact that they get frustrated when Brendan resists them on key facts, but are quick to praise him and say, oh, now we believe you, Brendan, whenever he picks up on some little cue that they've fed him or some little thing that they've suggested to him. And when he uses that and says something back to them they can use, they are of course quick to praise him. And this is also what is bothersome about all this, and it's so obvious to most of us. How did this get past the appeals court? I mean, I'm just wondering, how did the appeals court not see anything here? And the judges are right. Was special care even applied in this case? Because it certainly doesn't seem like it was. Brendan was victimized by his own counsel. He was, it's just a horrendous, list of atrocities that happened to Brendan, and it's just ridiculous. Now we're going to move into Luke Berg's weak sauce, explanation as to why Brendan could not think of the fact that Teresa had been shot in the head. I find this weak.
There was 8 questions in a row about whether they used the wires in the garage for anything. He never gave in to that. Why not? If he gave in to everything else, Why would he not give in to something like that?
Because he explains at one point, because he just couldn't think of anything. He couldn't come up with another thing to say, and he's at the end of his rope a few times and just has not enough imagination.
So you're talking about the question, who shot her in the head, and I think there's a very good explanation for why he couldn't think of it. Put yourselves in the investigator's shoes for a moment. They're trying to figure out what happened. They don't know the details. They
are telling him, we know everything, Brendan.
They know she was shot in the head, so they think that's how she died, and they're talking with Dassey about what happened in the bedroom. And then he says, Avery stabbed her, I cut her neck, Avery choked her, and they're thinking, well, she must be dead now, so why would Avery shoot a dead woman? That doesn't make any sense, so he must have shot her in the bedroom. And so they try and get to elicit that detail, and he can't think of it because his mind is in the bedroom. They don't find out until later that Avery actually shot her in the garage, like 10 minutes later. And so that's why Dassey couldn't think of it in the moment, because they have him focused in the bedroom. And so there's a very good explanation for why he couldn't think of it. And
which just goes to show all he's trying to do is figure out what's in their mind, how can I replicate what you're waiting to hear, and then you're going to praise me and say, good for you, you're going to feel better after this, and now we move on. And everything's going to be okay. We're in your corner, Brendan.
So there was Luke Berg's attempt to explain why Brendan couldn't think of the fact that she was shot in the head. Because the investigators were focusing on the bedroom, and they were talking about the bedroom, so Brendan had no way of thinking of what happened to her head anywhere else but in the bedroom. I think that when they were in his face, he would have been thinking about anything that happened to Teresa's head at any point. He wouldn't have just been limiting himself to the bedroom, in my opinion. So that's kind of what I find to be a little wonky about this particular theory of Luke Berg's. The most wonky about it, I guess. Yeah, I don't buy it. It's very weak to me that he would even suggest it. But then he goes on to say it wasn't until 10 minutes later that he says it was in the garage. No. Back up, Mr. Berg. First, he says it happens out by the fire pit. Okay? Then, when they come back and they want to pressure, they're starting to pressure him about things happening in the garage. Oh, Brendan, we know something happened in the garage. Blah 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 blah. The garage. Litany drumbeat. As Laura Nyrider puts it aptly. Put things in the garage, and suddenly he moves it from the fire pit to the garage. So I don't remember that happening in 10 minutes. So I think you're wrong about that. So, and you're also not taking into account the fact that it didn't go straight to the garage. It went to she was shot at the fire pit first, and then moved to the garage. So, I just found a problem with the fact that he didn't kind of have his facts straight and the way he was interpreting it. But anyway. So that's basically pretty much the end of his segment. He chooses to leave 5 minutes so that he can rebut at the end after Nyrider's time is up. So he leaves his last 5 minutes. So that's going to be about it for this video. The next couple videos, obviously, we'll move into Mrs. Nyrider or Laura Nyrider's interaction with the judges, and we'll probably break that into 2 different videos, like I did with Luke Berg. And then we'll probably do 1 additional video on Luke Berg's final rebuttal, his 5-minute rebuttal. So that's where we're headed with this anyways. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe and have a nice day.